Okay, so let's now make our component really flexible and reusable by defining a nice public API for consumers to use it. So right now, our component is quite unflexible and therefore not really reusable. So it might maybe be useful in one very specific case where we want the component to look and behave exactly like this, but it won't be useful for many other consumers. So if we imagine that we want to reuse this component in many other applications, or maybe even publish it to NPM to share it with all React developers around the world, then they will probably not find this component very useful right now. So those developers, or in other words, those consumers, they will probably want to define things like the colors of the stars, or maybe the sizes of the stars and the text, in order to basically make this component fit into their own applications. And so what we're going to do now is to try to define a good public API for this component, just as we learned before. And so by doing that, we will try to find that balance of using too few props and using too little props, so that the component also doesn't get way too complex. So let's get to work, and let's actually start with those two simple things that I just mentioned. So the color and the size. So let's just write that here, color and size. And as I mentioned also in the last lecture, it's a good idea to provide default values. So we already learned that we can do that by providing the default values during the structuring. So just like we did with the max rating. And so let's say that our default color will be this yellow of FCC419. And the default size, let's make it the number of 48. Okay. And now let's use these props in our component. So to basically accept the color and then change the stars and the text to fit that color. And the same for the size. So I want to start with the text. And so now I actually need to take this object here back into the component, because now we will specify some properties which will depend on the props. And so the props are, of course, only accessible inside the component. So then this object will have to live inside the component as well. So the color property will be set to color. And so we can actually just do it like this. And if we give this a save, then you see the text does indeed turn yellow. Now it might be a bit small. And so let's now also use the size. And so let's use a template literal and then use the size that we received as a prop and set the pixels to that. Well, that's maybe a bit too large. Let's try to divide this, for example, by 1.5, and that looks a bit nicer. All right, and now we should also use these values here, of course, for the stars themselves. So to do that, we will also now place this style object inside the star, and then we need these values also here. So the color and the size. And so, of course, then we need to pass them in here as props. So color and size and size. And so then here we can again create a template literal, get the size, and then pixels. Let's do the same for the height. And here nothing changed because we already had 48 here. And now finally the color is actually defined right in the SVG elements. So here we have the fill and the stroke of black, which is the reason why these are currently black. But if we change that here, like this, so color then you see that they just turned yellow. Now, of course, this other one isn't yellow yet because, well, it is still at black. So let's change that here as well. Okay, beautiful. So that's already a lot nicer than before. Let's just call another component here. And let's define some other size here. Let's say 24. And so here we have a much smaller component, but which still works in the same way. And of course, we can also specify the color, let's say red. And so with this, we just made our component a lot more flexible. So if someone wants to use this component in an application where the main color is red, then they can now easily change all of this to red. Now, sometimes consumers or users of the component want to have even more control over the styling. So sometimes it's a good idea to allow users to pass in a class name. So for example, a class name with the name of test, just in this case, which will then come from some CSS file in the application where this component is being used. So right now we don't have any class like this, but this is just really for testing purposes. So then here we need to accept the class name. And by default, it will just be an empty class name. And then we just add it here to the overall container. So class name, and then class name like this. So for example, if the user wants to somehow change the font style, they can do that right inside this class name that they pass in. And so that class name will then be added here and will then change the font family of our component. Now, another thing that I sometimes see on the web when we have a component like this is that instead of just displaying the rating number, is that they display like some message according to the rating. So in order to do that, we could pass in an array, and let's actually do that here. So we could pass in an array of messages, for example, saying that the first value is terrible, the second one is bad, then we have okay, good, well, as a string, and then amazing. And so now we can display these 5 values here, so these strings, instead of the numbers. So that's another nice touch that we can give our component here. So then we accept that prop here. And by default, let's make it an empty array. So really, really important to always give default values. And so now here we can use those values. However, we want, of course, to only use that messages array in case that there actually are some elements in there. And also the number of elements should be correct. So for example, if we allow for a rating between 1 and 5, but then we only have 3 elements in the array, then that doesn't make a lot of sense. So this wouldn't work. And so here, what we can do is to just check if messages.length is equal to the max rating. And if that is the case, then that means that a messages array was passed in. And if not, then we just do exactly what we had before. But in this case, let's then just display the messages at position rating -1 in order to convert back to 0-based index. And of course, we should also consider the temporary rating. So let's actually just copy what we have here, or maybe not. Okay, it's not that similar. So let's come here and say, if there is a temp rating, then use temp rating -1. And if not, then just use the regular rating -1. So again, if this looks confusing, then just make sure to pause the video and analyze that code. but this is just normal JavaScript at this point. But anyway, as you see, this works great now. So 1 star means terrible, bad, then it starts to become okay, good, and finally amazing. And of course, it also works with the not temporary rating, so with the fixed rating. While here, this other component where the messages array is empty, so that's the default here. So here it's empty, and so therefore we are still displaying just the number. Great. And let's keep going, because there is still at least one important thing missing, and that is to allow the consumer to set a default rating. Okay, so that's not very hard. So let's say, for example, that the user wants to start with a default of 3. Default rating should be 3. So the consumer might want to specify a prop like this. And so let's now then add that prop here and give it a default value. Now by default, the rating should be 0, which is exactly why that's what we put here, right? And so the default rating should be just that, 0. But of course, now we need to use this default rating, and we will use it right here instead of that 0. So basically, we will initialize our rating state with whatever default rating comes into the prop. And if that prop is not specified, then that's simply exactly the 0 that we had before. Now, maybe you heard or read that we should never initialize state from props. However, this is only true if you want the state variable to stay in sync with that passed in props. Or in other words, if you want the state value to update in case that the prop value is also updated. However, that is clearly not the case here. So we are really only using this default rating here basically as seed data. So really just as the initial state. And we don't care whether this value here maybe changes somewhere else in the application, so outside this component. And therefore, this is perfectly fine and normal to do. All right, so it's really no problem to initialize your state based on a prop. So I just wanted to address this point because I could already hear some people complaining about this. So this was more relevant in the old days of React before we had hooks, but now that's really no longer a problem. But anyway, as we save this now, you see that immediately we see the 3 ratings or the 3 stars as the default here. And of course, if this was 1 or 2, then that's what we will see there. And so again, that's just because we are now using this number 2 as the initial state value of our rating. All right. And now we could keep going here, of course, and add a lot more different props. So allowing for a lot more configuration. For example, we could say that we want the colors here to change according to the rating, or we could allow for some different spacing between the stars. We could also allow the consumer to specify on which side this text label here appears. So maybe they want it on the left or at the top or at the bottom here. But that might be going a bit too far here and maybe specifying too many props and adding too much complexity. So I think that what we have here right now is more than enough, except for one important thing that we are still missing right now. And that thing is the fact that the consumer might actually need this rating state outside of this component. And to exemplify this, let's come again back here. And what I want to do now, just temporarily, is to create a new component right here. Let's call it test. And so this component is then the one that will include the star rating. And let's say the color in this case is blue. Why not? And then let's also include that down here. And you will see why I'm doing this in this way in a minute. Okay, so here we have another one and a blue one. But now let's say that for some reason they also really needed to display this rating somewhere in their user interface. So for example, they might have a paragraph saying this movie was rated X stars. So here let's actually already use a max rating of 10. And so now what they want to happen is that whatever rating we specify here should then be displayed right here in the user interface. So now it should say here that the movie was rated 7 stars. So how will they do this right now? So they basically need access to the state, so to this rating state that we have inside the component, but right here, so inside of the test component. So what they need is some state. So let's say movie rating and set movie rating. And then use state. And let's again set it to 0. And then here let's use that movie rating. But of course, this now will not change at all when we rate the movie right here. So we need a way to update this state here whenever the state inside this component is updated as well. So how do we do that? Well, basically, we want to give the consumer of this component the ability to pass in a set function. So basically, we want them to allow to specify an onSet rating handler. And so in this case, what this component wants to pass in is simply this function right here. Okay, so let's now specify then this prop here. So we want to accept this very important prop right here. And this one by default doesn't need any default value. All right, and now it's very simple. All we have to do here is on the handle rating is to not only set the internal rating, but also to basically set the external rating. So we can now just say on set rating, also set that external rating. And with this, we now gave the outside test component basically the ability to get access to that internal state right inside this component. Okay, and now if we change this here, you see that it did indeed get updated to 7. So this additional configuration, so this final prop that we updated here, or that we actually added here to our component, was really, really important. Because without this, this component would really just be presentational in the end. I mean, it contains some state internally, but from the perspective of the test component, we couldn't really touch that state in any way. And therefore, we couldn't use that state inside this component, which then, again, wouldn't make this component really useful. Okay, so this was the final prop that we added. And as I said, we could keep going and get really crazy here with our configuration options. And you could, of course, if you wanted, allow some other things, such as the ones that I have mentioned earlier. But we will just leave it as this, because I think this right now is a pretty good balance. Now there's just one final thing that we need to do here in our component, which is to prevent the user basically to pass in some values that we do not want. So here, for example, this shouldn't be a string, right? Because, well, then this wouldn't work at all. So we need to make sure that this is actually a number here. And so let's look at something called prop types in the next lecture.